"Hey, old man, look up when I'm talking to you," Jake hissed through clenched teeth, his hand pressing down on the edge of Gordon's table as if trying to crush that stubborn silence. He leaned in close, breath heavy with beer, blowing straight into the face of the 80-year-old man, his eyes filled with naked contempt. "You think staying quiet makes you above us?" Gordon remained seated, unmoving, stirring his cold coffee as if Jake's growl had never existed. But only a few seconds later, the balance shifted, a slight tilt of the head, a slow rise of the eyes, a restrained breath released from Gordon, enough to make the entire diner fall silent as if someone had just squeezed the air out of the room. Jake froze. He could not understand the feeling, only knew that he had accidentally touched something he had no right to touch. No one said who Gordon was. No one revealed anything. His silence itself was a warning sharp as a blade, and that very thing drove Jake even further toward madness. So if you were Jake, would you still dare to pin a one-legged old man against the wall? Or would you step back the moment you realized you had crossed a dangerous line? When challenged by silence, would you push harder? Or would you stop to ask yourself, who are you really threatening? If this passage gave you chills, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us whether you stand with Gordon or with Jake. The war ended on paper, but the country had not returned to its old trajectory. People drove along wide boulevards as if there had never been artillery fire. Yet when the TV was turned on, the debates still circled back to one point: who has to pay for those years? A host on a cable channel repeated his familiar opening line: "The war is over, but the cost has never been fully calculated." Before Gordon Hughes muted the sound, he did not change the channel, letting the screen continue to show the anchor's mouth moving without producing sound. His hand lay motionless on his knee, his aged eyes looking through the image as if every discussion about the war were nothing more than copies printed again and again. Gordon stood up, taking hold of his cane by a habit that had settled into the rhythm of his life for decades. He left the small apartment and stepped into the long hallway of the subsidized building. The ceiling lights cast a pale glow, enough to clearly reveal the photos hanging crookedly on the walls. The words Veterans Appreciation Week had faded, the faces of the veterans in the frames blurred by dust. Gordon walked past without stopping to see who was still alive and who was gone, yet his eyes still skimmed each frame unconsciously, as if memory were searching on its own for familiar fragments. At the end of the hallway was the door of an empty apartment. His old roommate had passed away not long before. Gordon stopped at the door, back straight, hand gripping the handle of his cane tightly. He stood there long enough to feel the cold air seeping through the crack, as if the emptiness itself were breathing to its own rhythm. Then he turned and went down the stairs without looking inside. His shoes tapped a steady beat as he descended to the lower floor, the regular impact helping him focus on the present. Back in his own room, he set the prosthetic leg in its familiar corner and sat down. His hands slowly put on his shoes, the laces adjusted twice to sit neatly, even though no one would notice that tidiness. When he stood up, Gordon put on his jacket, pulled the collar up high, and stepped outside with the gait long accustomed to the pavement of a man with only one real leg. Outside the building, the air grew colder. The night wind carried the smell of vehicle fuel and dampness from lawns that had lost their color. A group of young men stood beside a gray pickup truck, their voices lively as they talked about the afternoon football game. They laughed loudly when someone mentioned a somewhat ridiculous play by a player. Gordon walked past without anyone needing to step aside because the walkway was still wide. Their laughter echoed behind him, light like the reverberation of a world no longer connected to him. Light from the 24-hour diner spilled onto the street, making the ground brighter than elsewhere. Tables and chairs inside were clearly visible through the large window. Gordon had entered this place enough times that he did not need to look at the sign to know where he was. When the door opened, the bell on the frame rang with a small but familiar sound. He stepped into the warmer space, the smell of coffee and hot butter mixing with the clink of utensils drifting from distant tables. He went straight to the table by the window, the table that had become the destination of every sleepless night. From this position, he could look out at the street and follow the scattered movement of a few late-passing cars. He leaned the cane against the table leg, angled slightly inward to avoid blocking the aisle. Gordon sat down, his hand resting lightly on the wooden tabletop, marked with scratches of unknown age. The server came over, her voice soft but clear. The usual, "Mr. Gordon." She did not ask much, nor did she try to draw him into conversation. Gordon nodded. He spoke little, not because he did not want to, but because the things worth saying had remained with those who were no longer here. When she left, Gordon looked through the glass. The street outside was sparse. Light from the street lamps fell onto the road, creating alternating patches of brightness and shadow. A motorcycle passed by, its engine sound fading toward the end of the street. Inside the diner, the wall clock made a dry click, signaling that midnight had passed. The air inside held the muted rhythm of steady breathing from the few remaining customers. The cup of coffee was set down in front of him. Gentle heat rose, the familiar bitterness spreading through his nose. Gordon cupped both hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into his knuckles. He drank in small sips, the taste of coffee anchoring him to reality like a final thread. The night stretched longer than he wanted. In that moment, everything seemed to stand still. A man in the far corner was turning the pages of a newspaper, the rustle of paper dry and light. A young couple sat near the counter, talking about moving to another state. Each sound fell into the space as if measured in advance, not loud enough to draw attention, but enough to remind Gordon that he was still living among people who did not carry memories as heavy as his. When he set the coffee cup down again, the diner door sounded its familiar noise. The doorbell rang a short beat, followed by the sound of military boots striking tile, firm and decisive. A rush of cold street air swept in, then drifted away as the door closed. Gordon heard them before he saw them, a familiar tone of people just back from a mission, voices buoyant with a hint of fatigue, but without guard. A group of young soldiers in Delta Force jackets entered, their voices bouncing off the tabletops and the ceiling like a strong gust, disturbing the diner's stillness. One of them burst out laughing, while recounting something that had happened not long ago. Another clapped him on the shoulder, their words overlapping, full of the vitality of those who believed their future was still long and wide. They pulled out chairs, light scraping sounds as the legs touched the floor, cutting across Gordon's stream of thought. He continued to look out the window, but his eyes gradually shifted focus as he sensed the change in the atmosphere. His heartbeat slowed by a beat, an old habit of vigilance from distant years slipping into his lungs with each breath. He listened to the sounds from the table behind him, laughter echoing softly off the walls, the strong register of young people who had just gone through something large enough to leave a mark. Gordon did not turn around. He kept his gaze directed outside, but his brow shifted slightly, a natural reaction to the presence of people carrying the smell of gunfire he knew all too well. The diner door closed completely, carrying with it the crisp laughter of the young soldiers, spreading into the night's otherwise quiet space. The laughter of the group of young soldiers echoed through the diner like excess energy from a battlefield that had not yet cooled. They chose a table in the middle of the room, where the light shone straight down onto jackets still dusted with grime and shoes clearly marked with sand. Their presence made the diner brighter, louder, disrupting the steady rhythm of late nights that were usually still like a flat lake. Gordon sat motionless in front of his cup of coffee, his gaze still directed toward the window, but his shoulders slightly tense, as if he were listening more than looking. Jake, the one leading the group, set an entire crate of beer down on the table with a hard thump that made the metal shells ring sharply. He spoke loudly, his voice mixed with fatigue and self-satisfaction. "Damn it, missions like this are more exhausting than training. The commanders think we're machines or something." The whole group laughed along, not because the line was hilarious, but because they were used to that kind of display. Young energy, strong, loud, as if trying to assert existence with every breath. One soldier in the group, smaller in build than the others, turned his head to look around the diner, as if only then realizing there were people other than them in the space. His eyes stopped on Gordon's jacket, where the old insignia had worn down to the point that its colors were hard to recognize. He spoke quietly to the person next to him, lowering his voice as if afraid of disturbing someone. "That badge, it's been a long time. You don't see many people still keeping one." The remark caught Jake's attention. He glanced toward Gordon, then gave a thin smile, the kind worn by someone who felt entitled to judge others. "He's probably showing off old stories. The older generation's always like that," Jake said, his tone half joking, half dismissive. Gordon did not turn around. He stirred the coffee that had already gone cold, the spoon tapping the side of the cup with a light, even sound, like a motion meant to steady himself. His steady stirring stood in complete contrast to the noise at the table in the middle of the room. Jake watched for a moment, then stood up, pushing his chair back with his foot, the legs scraping against the floor with a rough sound. He walked toward Gordon's table, His steps were strong and decisive, trained in a military environment, enough for anyone hearing them to know the approach was not meant to be polite conversation. Jake placed a hand on the back of Gordon's chair and pulled it slightly out of position, forcing Gordon to stop stirring his coffee. "Hey, old man, where's the service?" Jake asked. His voice was not loud, but sharp enough for people in the diner to know this was not a casual question. Gordon still did not turn around. He set the spoon down on the rim of the cup. He lifted the cup and took a sip, tilting his head slightly, as if listening to a distant sound rather than to the person in front of him. Jake saw that harmless reaction and felt irritation rise. Gordon's silence felt to him like a challenge. One soldier in the group called after him, his voice uncertain. "Drop it, Jake. Leave him alone." The intervention sounded like an instinctive response from someone uncomfortable with tension, but Jake ignored it. He stepped closer, his hand resting on the back of Gordon's chair as if claiming the space around him. "Or are you wearing all that just for show?" Jake said, his voice still carrying the arrogance of someone who believed he had the upper hand. A brief second after the question, Gordon set the coffee cup down, the soft contact with the table enough for Jake to know he had been heard. But Gordon still did not respond. That silence irritated Jake. He was not used to someone, especially an old man with a cane, not reacting. In the Delta Force environment, every order required acknowledgement, every question required an answer. Silence was a lenge, resistance, disrespect, and Jake read it that way. He bent lower, leaning in to force Gordon to look at him. His breath carried a faint smell of beer. "I'm talking to you. At least you could tell me where you were stationed, right? Or were you nothing at all?" Gordon slowly rotated the coffee cup with a small movement. His eyes remained fixed on the glass, where streetlights reflected faint streaks of light. He looked at the scene as if through a layer of mist, calm to the point that the person facing him could never tell what he was thinking. The smaller soldier sighed and spoke to Jake again. "Seriously, Jake, he doesn't look like he wants trouble." This time, the words sounded like a plea to stop, but Jake still did not care. Gordon's silence seemed to push each layer of his self-respect out of place, making him feel diminished in front of his teammates. Gordon adjusted his grip on the cane slightly, as if to reposition it more comfortably. That movement made Jake laugh. "You dodging me," he said, his tone mocking. Gordon did not answer, but the rhythm of the diner shifted. The owner, who had been wiping the counter, looked toward them, her eyes lingering for a second before she resumed her work. A pair of customers in the right corner stopped their conversation, silently glanced over, then returned to their unfinished meal. The air conditioner continued to run steadily, but the sound now felt like a helpless background noise. Jake leaned more weight onto Gordon's table. His fingers tapped against the surface, as if creating a rhythm meant to force Gordon to listen. He lowered his voice, but not to be friendly, to threaten. "Hey, old man, just say one thing. I asked where you're from, that's all." Gordon's coffee cup still sat in front of him, its heat completely gone. The dark liquid, flat and still, like the surface of a lake before a strong wind. His eyes shifted slightly, not to look at Jake, but to look into the darkness behind him, as if he were seeing past the man in front of him to another figure from many years ago. Jake grew more irritated, more convinced he was being disrespected. He lifted his hand and placed it flat on Gordon's table, taking the last remaining space between them. "I'm talking to you." The air inside the diner changed within just a few breaths. It was no longer the sound of a spoon touching a plate in the corner or the steady hum of the air conditioner, but a tightening sensation, as if someone had pulled a cord taut between two men of different generations. Gordon sat still, the coffee cup in front of him, completely cold now, the dark surface flat like a lake before a storm. Jake stood a few steps away, his hand still planted on the tabletop, demanding a reaction he believed he deserved. Gordon lifted his eyes. The look lasted so briefly it could have been mistaken for a natural flicker of the eye, but it was not. He looked directly at Jake for 1 second, a gaze cold, without anger, without pleading, then returned his attention to the coffee cup as if the entire existence of the man before him had passed without leaving a trace. Jake let out a dry, mocking laugh. "I'm asking you something, G, and you don't even have the decency to answer." He stressed the word decency, as if instructing a slow child, but his voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the feeling of being challenged. A man like him, accustomed to an environment where a command was instantly answered, could not tolerate Gordon's disregard. The diner owner stood behind the counter, holding a glass she had been wiping. She watched the scene through the barrier of the counter, her gaze slowing, as if weighing whether to intervene or remain silent. Her diner had seen many arguments involving young soldiers, especially after difficult missions, but something in Gordon's posture told her this situation was not like the others. Jake leaned toward Gordon, his voice louder. "People like you ruined an entire generation. Do you think you contributed anything? Take a good look." His words rang clearly through the space, causing two customers near the door to pause mid-conversation, one lowering his head toward his newspaper to avoid eye contact, the other shifting his chair slightly inward. Gordon kept his back straight, his hand calmly rotating the coffee cup, an old habit to keep his body from reacting to the raised voice so close to him. He still did not answer. No rebuttal, no defense, no sign of offense, no indication that he viewed Jake as a threat. That composure struck directly at Jake's ego, cutting deeper with every passing second. One young soldier from Jake's group, the one who had tried to intervene earlier, turned his face away. He looked down at his shoes, his hand resting on his knee, tightening slightly, discomfort plainly visible. It was not fear, but the sense that something about Jake's behavior was wrong. In their unit, they were taught control, not to intimidate an old man late at night in a brightly lit diner. Jake leaned closer, both hands on the edge of Gordon's table, as if trying to seize the last remaining distance between them. "You think you're above us? Is this silence like you're looking down on people? Or are you trying to act mysterious so someone has to guess what you used to do?" Gordon did not move. He did not fold inward like someone weak, nor did he spring up like someone ready to fight. He simply sat there and took one slow breath, keeping his balance. His eyes still did not turn toward Jake. They rested on the cold coffee cup, and reflected in its surface was a blurred outline of the man standing before him. A young figure, hurried, carrying the fresh breath of combat, but lacking something Gordon knew all too well, the weight of memory. Gordon's silence made Jake feel as if he were about to explode. He stepped half a pace closer, his hand striking the table lightly, not a hard blow, but enough to make the diners flinch. There was no shouting, no insults, but the level of threat had climbed to a new tier. A spoon from the young couple's table in the corner slipped from the edge and rang out with a thin sound, sharp and brief before fading. The atmosphere seemed compressed into a single mass. In that moment, the diner owner stopped wiping the glass. Her hand let the cloth fall onto the counter, her fingers trembling slightly as they touched the familiar wooden surface. She had known Gordon for many years. He was one of the diner's most constant faces, appearing and leaving like part of the place's rhythm. She had known him from when he was stronger, steadier on his feet, and still capable of hiding the pain in his eyes. She had also seen him stand for a long time outside the door, as if preparing to enter a world he did not want, but had to, because there was nowhere else for him to go. Watching the scene now, she understood that his silence was not the silence of a weak man. Jake leaned in again, so close that his breath brushed the tabletop. "Look around. The whole place is waiting for you to open your mouth. Stop acting like you're above it all. Say it. Who are you? Just say one thing." Gordon did not move. His eyelids lowered a fraction, as if listening to something inside rather than outside. An old soldier knew how to exhaust an opponent without offering a single answer. All his survival experience gathered into that calm, and it threw Jake off balance. When Jake took another step forward, the owner turned her back. Her shoulders tightened slightly as she moved behind the counter to where the old wall-mounted telephone had hung for years. She placed her hand on the receiver, her breath held, her eyes flicking between Gordon and Jake as if asking herself whether this was truly necessary. Then she lifted the phone, her small frame contrasting sharply with the firm way she held the receiver, and dialed the emergency military contact number of the nearby base. As the line began to ring softly, she did not turn back. She knew she had done what needed to be done. The air in the diner grew thick. Each breath from Gordon and Jake seemed to press against the other without blending into a shared rhythm. Gordon's coffee had cooled to the point where the dark surface no longer gave off steam, yet his hand still rested on it as if clinging to a familiar anchor. Jake leaned forward, lowering himself to be sure. Gordon heard every word, each question like a shove against a door being forced shut. The silence had now become a flame licking around the edges of an imminent explosion. The young soldier behind Jake swallowed hard, understanding that this situation had gone beyond the usual taunting common among combat troops. The diner owner kept her back turned, worry bending her posture slightly, her hand still gripping the receiver of the wall-mounted phone. Then the door opened, not with a slam or the loud laughter of a drunk group, but with the calm sound of old hinges. Slow and deliberate, a rush of cold air flowed in, lightly stirring the napkins on the counter. The entire diner seemed pulled toward the light entering through the doorway, As the man stepped inside, Colonel Reeves stood at the threshold, his posture solid like a marker in the desert. His military jacket was dark, soaked with the night's cold, the shoulders slightly dusty but not untidy. He stood straight, shoulders slightly open, one hand holding a paper coffee cup bought at some auxiliary facility near the base. To an outsider, there was nothing remarkable in Reeves's eyes, but to soldiers, that look alone was enough to make anyone on base straighten their back. No one in the diner spoke. Even the faint sound of a spoon touching a plate in the far corner stopped. Reeves did not enter immediately but paused for a few seconds, his gaze sweeping quickly across the space. The diner was warm, adequately lit, and sparsely occupied. Nothing drew attention at first, and then he saw the exchange between Jake and Gordon. His gaze stopped. Reeves looked at Gordon first. He did not blink as he took in the old veteran's seated posture, the cane leaning against the table leg, the faded insignia on the jacket, the eyes lowered to the coffee cup, while the body maintained a subtle defensive stance. A man who had passed through many battlefields, needed only a breath, a hand placement, to recognize someone from the same system. Reeves recognized him immediately. After observing Gordon, he shifted his gaze to Jake and the rest of the group. His silence carried weight, as if in those brief seconds every assessment had been logged into his military memory with precision. Reeves stepped further into the diner. His footsteps were light, but audible, the sound of someone accustomed to walking on discipline rather than emotion. He spoke 2 short words, without raising his voice, without changing tone. "Step back." Jake kept his hand on Gordon's table. Reeves's words made his back stiffen slightly, like a reflex triggered by a superior's command, but the ego surging in him held him in place. There was something in Reeves's demeanor that made Jake feel examined, as if that gaze cut through the noisy surface the young soldiers used to mask their exhaustion. No one in the group moved. They glanced at one another. A young soldier spoke so softly it was barely audible. "Jake," but the word faded as Reeves took another step forward. "I won't say it a second time." This time, Reeves's voice was still not loud, but its weight caused the 2 soldiers behind Jake to pull back immediately, as if yanked off balance, retreating a few steps toward their table. One of them exhaled quietly, the sound betraying his tension. Jake stepped back half a beat slower, not because he was fearless, but because he was trying to preserve a shred of pride in front of his teammates. He lowered his hand, his sleeve brushing lightly against Gordon's table, producing a small sound like a final sign of resistance. Reeves moved into the space between Gordon and Jake. He stood straight, feet set just wide enough for balance, shoulders open, paper coffee cup in hand. He did not step close enough to threaten, nor retreat to create safety for the other man. Simply by standing at that exact distance, he forced Jake to lift his head. "You do not have the right to stand here," Reeves said. He did not shout or emphasize each word, but the voice was decisive, like a deployment order. It carried the weight of years of combat, of reports he had signed, of names that had been left behind, and that he still had to read at the start of every briefing. Jake opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. What was blocked was not speech, but the hardened confidence of a young soldier newly released into the real world. Reeves's look held neither contempt nor anger. It was the look of someone who had seen too much to waste time on the impulsiveness of the young. Reeves held that gaze for a few seconds, then turned to Gordon. He did not bend down or show pity. His eyes moved quickly and precisely over every detail: the scuffed cane, the prosthetic leg hidden beneath the pant leg, the faded old insignia on the jacket. The seated posture subtly shifted backward to maintain balance against Jake's intimidation. Gordon did not look at Reeves, but a small change at the corner of his eyes showed that he registered the presence of the man who had just entered. 2 seasoned soldiers could recognize each other without words. Reeves set his coffee cup down on a nearby empty table, releasing it carefully to avoid unnecessary noise. Then he spoke in a low, exact voice, each word measured before leaving his mouth. "You were part of the Titan program. Confirm." The moment Reeves spoke the 2 words Titan program, the diner fell into complete stillness, not the silence of surprise, and not fear. It was the silence of people who did not understand, yet could clearly sense that some boundary had just been touched, a line the young people in the diner had never known existed. Gordon lifted his head. His eyes met Reeves directly, not in confrontation, not in avoidance, like an old soldier stepping out of his own shadow to see whether memory was distorting the present. He did not speak, This time, the silence carried no defense or evasion. It was like confirmation, like the nod of someone who had lived inside a system where every word was used sparingly. Reeves held that gaze for a few seconds, then straightened his back. The movement was so clean and precise that the military jacket followed a single narrow line. It was not the kind of salute meant for ceremonies or displays before superiors. It was the reflex of someone who had been through things that a few spoken words could never describe. He said nothing while making the motion, yet that silence conveyed more than any explanation. The entire diner watched the moment. The customer holding the newspaper froze, eyes peering over the rim of his glasses. The young couple near the counter drew their feet inward, as if pulled into a story they had no standing to enter, but could not look away from. Each person felt something different, but all understood that Reeves had not walked in for entertainment, or to take offense on someone's behalf. He had entered as something much larger. No one in the diner knew what Titan was, but the way Reeves asked, the way Gordon answered with silence, and the way the air shifted after only a few breaths made Titan feel like a submerged stone beneath the surface, only a small part visible, yet heavy enough to sense the weight below. Reeves shifted his gaze to the two young soldiers standing behind Jake. He did not raise his voice, nor did he try to intimidate. Name, rank. The two soldiers jolted slightly at the words, like a reflex programmed by military life. One answered first, his voice just steady enough not to shake, but stripped of the confidence they had carried when they entered the diner. The other spoke more slowly, glancing down at the tips of his boots for a second before lifting his head to report. Both knew Reeves was not asking for introductions, but for memory. In the military, a senior officer remembering your name in a moment like this was not a good thing. Reeves gave a slight nod after hearing them. Not encouragement, not acceptance. It was the nod of someone marking information before moving to the next step. He looked at them for another brief moment, as if to be certain they understood the seriousness of the situation. Tonight, everything still stands. The sentence was short, but the space felt as if the air had been drawn out of it. The two young soldiers straightened their backs by reflex, neither speaking. One of them swallowed, sensing what Reeves was implying. If tonight everything remained, then tomorrow it would not. Everyone understood, though no one dared to say it aloud. Reeves turned to Jake. There was no anger in his eyes, and no disappointment, only a direct assessment, heavy as stone, that made Jake lift his head instinctively. Reeves stood still before him, his shoulders, not broad, yet giving the impression that Jake was facing a wall he could not climb. Tomorrow morning, it won't. Jake did not react immediately. He heard the words, but his mind needed a few beats to catch up with their meaning. Growing up, he had rarely received warnings that carried final judgment. On base, he was used to laughter, jokes, and the shouted commands of officers during training. But Reeves's sentence was different. It was not an order or a reprimand. It sounded like the final statement of someone who had already seen an outcome Jake could not avoid. Jake opened his mouth to say something, likely to reclaim a shred of pride, or even to deflect with a joke, but no words came out. Every sound caught in his throat, blocked by the realization that he had crossed a boundary he had not known existed, but now saw with absolute clarity. Reeves looked at Jake for one more second, then turned to Gordon. His gaze softened slightly, no longer sharp as it had been with the young soldiers. It was not respect in a ceremonial sense, but more like the look of someone who had shared the same darkness that those standing nearby could never understand. Gordon returned his attention to his coffee cup. He rotated it gently with his hand, as if adjusting his breathing. Reeves watched the motion, and in that moment, no one in the diner understood what the two men had exchanged without words. Reeves did not remain longer. He picked up the paper coffee cup he had set down earlier, checked that the lid was secure, a careful habit of someone who had lived too long in environments where precision mattered. Then he turned toward the door. As he passed the group of young soldiers, the sound of his shoes against the floor was not loud, but each step carried a sense of finality. Jake stood rigid, as if his body were trying to hold itself together while everything inside was shaking. The other young soldiers stayed silent, staring at their hands or watching Reeves with eyes caught between fear and embarrassment. Before leaving the diner, Reeves paused for half a second. He did not turn around. He spoke clearly, decisively. "We will talk about this at the base." The night Reeves ordered the Delta Force group to step back in the diner. It passed through the base like a heavy layer of dust, settling. There were no alarm sirens, no emergency assembly orders, and no one was escorted out of their sleeping quarters. Everything unfolded in a silence so complete that the young soldiers found it more unsettling than a formal reprimand. Near midnight, they were summoned to the duty office. Rows of cold fluorescent lights shone down on straight metal tables, making the shadows at their feet stretch longer than usual. Each person was given a blank sheet of paper and a pen. No instructions were given on what to write beyond the 2 words, "Incident Report." Even the officer on duty did not look at them for long. He set the stack of paper down and said only one sentence, "Be clear, as clear as possible." No one spoke. That silence was a continuation of the slap from the night in the diner. Each man bent over his paper, pens dragging out stiff lines. The only sounds in the room were pen against paper, the turning of pages, and the faint scrape of a chair as someone shifted position. Jake sat at the end of the table, his back against the wall, the light casting a pale bluish color across his face. He held the pen but needed several seconds before he could write the first line. His handwriting was uneven, jagged, as if his hand were resisting him. A security officer walked back and forth several times, his shoes producing a steady clicking sound. When the group finished writing, he collected the pages one by one, stacking them into a thin bundle. He looked at them for a moment and said, "Wait for orders." His voice was flat and cold, neither reproachful nor reassuring. The silence afterward was so dense, the air seemed to congeal. Jake felt sweat soaking the back of his shirt, even though the duty office was not warm. The group left the room, everyone's steps light and slow. No one wanted to be the first to speak. It was as if an invisible cord bound them together, tying guilt and tension to a single point. The next morning, the base woke on its usual rhythm. The bugle sounded, squads lined up for breakfast, and the smell of coffee and eggs spilled out of the mess hall. But Jake entered that space with a completely different feeling. The sliding glass door opened, and he heard the sound immediately as he stepped through, a conversation cutting off mid-sentence. He took a few steps inside, his eyes sweeping over familiar faces. Some people looked down at their trays, some shifted to other tables. Even the tall soldier who had shaken his hand the afternoon before, the one Jake had always considered an ally in the unit, avoided his gaze. Jake raised a hand to greet him, but the man lowered his head and moved quickly to another line, as if instinct told him to steer clear of something he should not be involved in. Jake chose an empty seat near the window. He sat down and picked up the steel spoon. The cold metal touched the heat of his palm. A few seconds later, his grip tightened until his fingers turned white. The spoon bent slightly, as if absorbing his anger in place of whatever he wanted to hurl against the wall. The glass beside him reflected his image, warped by the condensation from the dining hall. Jake stared at it for a long time. For the first time in many years, he could not recognize himself. The man in the reflection was not the squad leader from the night before, not the man who had just completed a difficult mission, not the one who believed his voice carried weight. The reflected face was quiet and uncertain, bearing something like a young man straining inside a jacket too large for him. He looked down at his tray but could not swallow. A tightness rose in his chest. The humiliation from the night before dragged along with it, a persistent thought, like a thorn lodged in his ribs. The feeling of being shut down by Reeves's order, the feeling of being pushed out of the leader's position, the feeling of being judged in front of his peers. Everything became a layer of hot ash slowly settling into his stomach. "That old man, this isn't over," Jake whispered. He did not say it to anyone, but the whisper sounded like a promise to himself, a reckless promise from someone young who did not know where to put an ego that had just been stripped bare. In the depth of his voice, it was not hard to sense that he did not want the story to end at this breakfast table. He needed something to regain balance, an action to erase the feeling of being diminished. No one in the unit looked at him again. They ate quickly, stood up quickly, and then left with weary steps. Only Jake remained, sitting with the bent spoon, his gaze fixed on the tabletop as if pulled into a thought no one else could read. By afternoon, the base returned to its normal pace. Units trained, trucks moved across the yard, and officers conducted inspections. But for Jake, the day stretched twice as long as any other. His body carried out assigned tasks, but his mind drifted constantly between anger, shame, and doubt. Reeves's words felt like a cut on the skin, not deep but burning, irritating him with every breath. By evening, Jake still had not found calm. He stood before the mirror in the barracks bathroom, washing his face, watching the water run into the sink. The reflection was still his face, but the eyes were different. The familiar confidence was gone, replaced by something tighter and darker. As night fell, the base quieted under dim yellow lights. Many were asleep or watching TV in the common area, but Jake left the housing block and walked along the road leading to the main gate. His figure rose and fell under the streetlights, each step pressing down on thoughts that had not cooled. The late wind moved between the low buildings, carrying a chill. Jake fastened his jacket tightly and kept going. No one stopped him. No one asked where he was going. The guards glanced at him as he passed, then returned to their posts. In the distance, the sign of the 24-hour diner glowed in the darkness, white light spilling onto the road. Jake stopped briefly near the gate, his hand clenching, his breathing heavier. His face was clearly visible under the yellow street lamp above, features tightened by irritation mixed with something he had not yet named. He stared straight toward the diner, his eyes darkening, holding what remained of a humiliation that had not faded. Night settled. Jake stood in front of the 24-hour diner, its lights washing over his rigid face. The night reached the base with a heaviness no one put into words. The sleeping barracks grew darker, leaving only a few square windows glowing faintly like markers of rest hours. In that silence, Jake could not sleep. He lay facing the wall, then turned toward the door. But no matter how many positions he changed, the sensation of falling clung to his chest. Reeves's words, the looks from his teammates, Gordon's expressionless face, all blended until he could no longer tell whom he was angriest at, them or himself. When Jake got up, the wall clock showed close to midnight. He put on his jacket, zipped the collar closed, and stepped outside without a sound. The door closing behind him sounded heavier than on any other night. 3 soldiers from his former group followed a few steps behind. No one called out for him to stop, but each of them carried a look of hesitation. One tried to keep his voice low. "Jake, you should rest tonight. There are a lot of drills tomorrow." It was not a real attempt to stop him, just a habitual response. When something felt off course, Jake kept walking, his body tensing with every step. The anger he thought he had swallowed down that morning rose back up in layers, making his eyes burn. The stretch of road from the base to the main gate was not long, but he walked it as if it were the only path that would let him breathe. The night guards watched them pass, gave faint nods, asked nothing. Jake stayed silent until the light of the T24-hour diner appeared in the distance. The diner's sign was still glowing white, cold and steady, as every other night. The building stood unmoving in the wind like an anchor point in the darkness. To Jake, it was no longer a place to eat or rest, but a stage where the night before, he had collapsed in front of everyone. He clenched his hand, then pushed the door. The bell rang out with a thin, clear sound in the quiet space. The light inside the diner fell across his face, revealing the irritation that had been building for hours. Behind him, his 3 teammates filed in more slowly by half a beat, their eyes darting between one another, as if sharing the same question no one dared to voice. Gordon sat at the old table, where he sat every night. The coffee cup was in front of him, no steam rising anymore. His hand rested still on the tabletop, the wrinkles sharply defined under the white light. He did not lift his head at the sound of the bell, did not turn, even though he knew someone was approaching. His breathing was even, his gaze fixed on the window, as if he were trying to preserve the fragile calm of the long night. One soldier in Jake's group, the one who seemed the least impulsive, lowered his voice and said, "Leave him alone. Let's go back." Jake, his voice was small and rough, as if he were saying something he himself was not sure would be listened to. Jake did not answer. He moved toward Gordon's table, his steps firm, leaning into the space that belonged to the old veteran. He stood beside the table, not sitting down like before, creating a difference in position that he believed would give him the upper hand. "You think yesterday is over?" Jake asked. His voice was not loud, but it carried the sharp edge of someone holding anger in so it would not burst into shouting. The question hung in the air for a moment, as if pushing Gordon to say something. Gordon lifted the coffee cup and took a small sip. The cold liquid did not change his expression. He set the cup down, his hand not shifting position on the table. There was no quickened breath, no sign that he was concerned by the presence of the soldiers behind him. That silence irritated Jake more than any direct rebuttal would have. No one who had truly been through combat needed to shout to prove anything. But Jake did not understand that yet. He saw Gordon's indifference as a denial of the humiliation he had carried all day. He leaned closer, his gaze fixed straight on Gordon. "You like making people look stupid in front of their commanding officer, don't you?" Jake said, his voice dropping, each word falling heavy like metal. Gordon kept his posture unchanged, but this time, he raised his head. The movement was simple, not abrupt, but it made the space around them slow by a beat. His eyes met Jake's directly, far too calm for the tension of the moment. That gaze held no anger or contempt. It carried something deeper and colder, like someone who had seen many young, furious faces before, and knew that none of them truly understood what they were standing in front of. Jake flinched for a brief instant. He recognized that feeling immediately, and he hated it. It was the awkwardness of inexperience, the thing every young soldier tried to hide on base. He lowered his voice. "You're looking at me like you know who I am." Gordon did not change his gaze. 1 second, then 2, long enough for Jake to feel as if someone were stripping away each outer layer. Behind them, 2 young soldiers near the door glanced at each other. One stepped back half a pace, his hand tightening on his cap strap, as if pulled tight by the fear of something slipping out of control. The other took a sharp breath and shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, as if to avoid looking at Jake's back. Gordon lowered his eyes to the coffee cup, then raised them again, this time looking deeper into Jake. He rotated his wrist slightly, as if resetting something within himself. There was no trembling, no sign of someone cornered. He was simply preparing to speak. Jake straightened. Tension surged across his chest. He did not know what he expected from this old ma, an apology, a justification, or a reaction that would give him a reason to explode. His hand curled slightly. Gordon opened his mouth. His voice was slow and clear, not loud, but more than enough for Jake in the diner to hear. "You don't understand where you're standing." The small diner sank into a silence as thick as the night air. The remaining customers did not leave, but neither did they dare look directly at the 2 men facing each other. A few spoon taps against plates shattered, and then died out. The white light cast down onto the tables made the lines on Gordon's face stand out, each wrinkle seeming carved from a metal colder than the air outside. Gordon braced his hand on the table and shifted his weight onto the cane. When he stood, his body tilted slightly, and the pain from the amputated leg made his breathing hitch for 1 beat. No one knew how much he hurt, but the sound of the cane striking the tile, dry and sharp, made the whole room pause. He straightened his back, adjusted his stance with a care that made one thing clear to anyone. Watching this was not the posture of a frightened man. Jake stood opposite him, shoulders tight and eyes hot. The entire day on base, Reeves's words, the silence in the mess hall, the averted looks of his teammates, all of it had fused into a single mass knotted in his chest. He did not know what angered him more: Gordon's silence, Reeves's intervention, or his own failure to escape the situation. Now, seeing Gordon stand, the sense of being outmatched surged straight into his throat. Gordon looked at him without turning away. "You're retelling a story." Jake laughed, a thin sound that was not quite amusement. "Then tell it again. I want to hear the real version and see if it's any different." Gordon shook his head, very slowly. "No, that's not your story." The words made Jake tilt his head, his vision blurring for a beat, as if he no longer understood what they were even talking about, or understood all too well, and refused to accept it. He planted both hands on the edge of the table and leaned forward, his shadow spilling over Gordon. "Back to talking in circles. You sound like you think you hold everything in your hands." Gordon drew a breath, his chest rising slightly from standing too long. He turned to look at the 3 soldiers behind Jake, his gaze passing over each young face, still unfinished, like stones just placed into a furnace with no idea what they would become. "You've never signed your name to the consequences." One young soldier behind Jake stiffened, his eyes dropped, the hand hidden in his jacket pocket tightening. The words did not need volume, yet they landed squarely in the deepest place of a soldier. Fresh from the field, they knew disaster was real, but had never faced its price. Jake's face tightened, his lips pulling into an unreadable smile. "Who do you think you are, standing there lecturing us? You think a few old scars give you the right to say anything you want?" Gordon was not angry. From beginning to end, he did not let himself fall into anger. He stood with a calm so complete, it made people wonder how much he had lived through to reach it. He turned back to Jake, this time looking deeper, as if seeing through the young soldier's outer shell. "I'm the one who was there." Jake pressed his lips together. He did not want that answer. He wanted an excuse, wanted to see Gordon waver, to prove that he, too, could break. But the words were neither weak nor forceful. They stood as an unarguable fact. Jake opened his mouth to speak, but Gordon continued, his voice steady but slower, sharp like a clean cut. "And you're just living off what was edited out." In that instant, the entire diner seemed to stop. Not a sound intruded. A customer in the corner dropped a spoon into a bowl of soup, the noise ringing out and then vanishing as if swallowed. Jake did not move, but from his shoulders to his clenched hands, every muscle tightened like drawn wire. His eye twitched, not from fear, but because the words dragged up something he had buried for years. The image of his father coming home from war with empty eyes, silent for a full year before leaving the family without ever speaking about the past. Jake had grown up believing silence was weakness. He had joined Delta Force partly to be nothing like that man. and now that same silence was striking back at him. In Gordon's voice, his fists clenched until his knuckles went white. His breathing grew heavy and uneven. A soldier behind him whispered, "Jake, back off, that's enough." But the warning fell away the moment it was spoken. He did not step back, did not turn, did not move aside. His eyes locked onto Gordon's aged face, as if searching it for something to steady himself, or to justify the rage boiling up. Gordon stood firm, one hand gripping the cane, the other hanging loose at his side. His stillness was a wall that could not be breached by anger alone. Jake lifted his chin, his voice dropping low, small but sharp. "You sound really impressive, but who gave you the right to talk like that? You think you understand everything?" Gordon did not blink. "I don't need to understand everything. I've seen enough." A breath tore through Jake like wind feeding a flame waiting to catch. He could not endure that answer. It offered no exit, no opening for counterattack, no foothold to excuse the chaos in his chest, his unnamed pain, the absence he never spoke about from his family, the disappointment in himself since the night Reeves appeared. All of it collapsed into a single point, the old man standing in front of him, calm as if he had already known how this would end. Jake lifted his foot and stepped toward Gordon, as if that step had been waiting a long time for its chance to slide past his restraint. His hand clenched, tendons rising under the white diner light. The air in the diner tightened around the movement, drawing every gaze toward it. One customer dropped a newspaper and did not bend to pick it up. The owner held her breath behind the counter. A cold draft slipped in from the glass door, brushing across the table where Gordon's coffee cup stood unmoving. Jake took another step, his fist locked tight in the cold light of the 24-hour diner. The silence in the diner after Gordon's final words was unlike any silence before it. It hung there, heavy, with something fragile stretched tight between the two men standing face to face. Outside, the night on the street continued at its steady pace, cars passing the windows now and then, but inside the small diner, time felt cut off. The few remaining customers sat scattered, keeping their eyes fixed on different corners, as if no one dared look straight ahead, but no one could pretend they were not seeing. Jake, after taking another step forward, did not stop there. He drew a sharp breath and poured all of his anger into his clenched hands. The tendons in his neck stood out, his shoulders rising in the familiar reflex of someone about to launch into a confrontation where reason no longer had a place. He was no longer thinking about Reeves, the base, the humiliation of the morning, or the written reports. There was only one thing left in his mind now, Gordon, and the words he had just spoken. The words that had torn open the shell of pride Jake had struggled to hold together. He grabbed Gordon by the collar. The motion was so fast that the soldier behind him had no time to react. Jake's hand seized the fabric at the center of Gordon's chest and yanked him closer. Their faces were separated by only a narrow space, close enough for their breaths to mix. Jake's eyes were red, half from rage, half from something deeper he had not yet found a name for. "Shut up," he said, his voice hoarse and short, dragged across gravel. Gordon did not raise his hands to pull Jake's grip away, nor did he lean back to avoid him. He stayed where he was, using what strength he had left to keep his balance while being dragged forward. Someone who had survived a real battle knew how to recognize the moment when an opponent truly lost control. Gordon looked straight into Jake's eyes and said, without raising his voice, without hurry, "Don't." Those words, instead of making Jake step back, made him angrier. There was something in that calm that made him feel dismissed, judged, placed exactly where he had spent his life trying to escape, the years of training that had left his body bruised, the missions he had volunteered to lead. All of it seemed reduced to a single quiet sentence spoken by an old man with a cane. Jake released his grip, not to stop, but to switch to something else. He stepped back half a pace and let out a short laugh. It was not real laughter, more like air forced out by someone trying to push pain behind anger. The three soldiers who had come with him stood behind, watching, none of them knowing what to say. They looked at Jake, at Gordon, then at each other. In their eyes was a vague sense of regret, but none of them had the strength to intervene. Gordon braced on his cane, gripping the handle with a movement practiced too many times. He leaned forward slightly to shift weight onto the prosthetic leg. A small breath escaped him, as pain pulled sharply at his hip. It was the weakest moment he had shown all night, and Jake saw it. Before Gordon could steady himself again, Jake lifted the toe of his boot and struck hard at the cane. The motion was fast, decisive, sharp, like a reflex drilled into close combat training. The cane slipped from Gordon's hand, struck a table leg, and flew sideways. Gordon immediately lost his support. His body tried to compensate with his remaining leg, but the weight was too much. For an instant, the old veteran tilted to the left, then fell toward the floor as if time itself had slowed. He hit the ground. His hip and arm struck first, A metallic sound rang out as the cane slammed into the corner of a chair leg, rolled several times across the tile, and came to rest. The sound was sharp, cold, unmistakable, as if something in the room had just snapped. One customer jumped to his feet, his chair scraping across the tile. "Hey," he shouted, his voice jolted by shock and outrage, but he did not make it forward, his body freezing when he saw what was unfolding next. Gordon lay on his side, one hand pressed to the floor. As he tried to push himself up, he did not cry out, but his breathing stretched long and heavy. His gray hair fell forward, partially covering his cheekbone. His shoulders trembled slightly with the effort to hold himself up. The chair beside him was still vibrating from the impact. Jake stood there, his hand still half clenched, heat rushing into his face, no longer sure what to do next. He had not planned this step, not at all. But now that he had knocked Gordon down, he could not retreat, not because he believed he was right, but because stepping back would mean admitting what he never wanted to face, that the weakness was not in Gordon, but in himself. A soldier standing near Jake reached out as if to stop something, but his hand met only empty air. He swallowed hard, his throat visibly working. "Jake," he whispered, so softly that almost no one heard it, but Jake did, and because he did, he moved deeper into what he had never expected. One beat passed. Two. Gordon placed a hand on the table to pull himself up, then failed. He braced again on the floor, his breathing now fully compressed. An 81-year-old body, one that had endured major injuries, no longer responded like it once had. He tried to turn, but pain from the amputated leg made every movement uncertain. A server parted her lips as if to call for help, but her eyes stopped on something near the far end of the counter. There, the phone still sat exactly where it always did, resting against a neatly folded cloth. Its front camera pointed toward Gordon and Jake. It did not vibrate, did not flash with notifications, and did not turn off. A small white indicator light, dim but clear, reflected faintly on the glass. It was like an unblinking eye, recording every movement, every fall, every heavy breath, every stunned look from the customers. The phone captured everything. It stood there, calmer than anyone in the room, as if it already knew that what was happening in this moment would not end in the diner, would not be resolved by an old man standing back up, would not conclude with a soldier walking out the door. It would follow them into tomorrow, and beyond. After that fall, the diner held no sound worthy of being called noise, no chairs scraping, no shouting, no curses, no instinctive crowd reaction to violence. Everything froze. Even the wall clock, which had ticked steadily for years, seemed to slow by a beat. Gordon lay on his side, his hand trembling slightly as he tried to press against the tiled floor to lift himself. The trembling was not fear. It was the echo of a body worn down by decades of accumulated pain, made worse by the sudden fall caused by a young man breaking apart inside. He paused for a few seconds to draw breath. The hand braced on the floor showed raised veins, thin but firm, as if his entire body were leaning on the last patience he had left. Jake stood nearby, his face gone cold, as if it had been frozen into an expression he could no longer control. The hand that had knocked the cane away was still half clenched, shaking slightly, but not purely from fear. He no longer knew what he was seeing. One part of him tried to justify it as reflex. Another knew every excuse was useless. The worst part was not the kick itself, but the moment he realized Gordon was too weak to keep his balance. He knew, and he did it anyway. Gordon pressed down again, slowly lifting his shoulders. A short breath escaped, then he shifted strength into his left arm, dragging his body up from the floor. His aged body did not respond as quickly as he wanted. His back curved, his head dipped, but he persisted, inch by inch. Each lift was like a small step in a climb he had known for a long time. No one stepped forward to help, not out of refusal, but because the silence had swallowed every instinct to act. A young soldier behind Jake lowered his head, gripping the brim of his cap so tightly the tendons stood out. He could not bring himself to look at Gordon again. Each glance made him feel as if he were standing inside a wrong he did not know how to escape. His face burned, his ears flushed red, his chest tightening as if he had sprinted without permission to breathe. Gordon shifted his body, slowly, and finally managed to sit up. He reached behind himself for support, clutching the edge of the table to keep from falling again. He stayed there for a few seconds, head lowered, breathing steadier. Then he looked around for his cane. It lay angled near the leg of a chair to the right, the handle turned toward the wall. Gordon reached with his left hand, stretching lightly, but it was not far enough. He had to lean fully to the side, bracing with his right hand, fingers trembling as they touched the cold metal. When the cane settled firmly in his hand, no one, in the diner, breathed out. Gordon lifted it, adjusted the grip, and rotated it slightly to be sure the joint had not shifted in the fall. Satisfied, he used the cane to stand. It took nearly half a minute. Gordon stood upright to the degree his body allowed. His back was slightly curved, his right shoulder lower than the left as the prosthetic leg took weight more slowly. But he stood. There was something very still in that moment. Not the stillness of weakness, but the stillness of a final choice standing up to close everything. Jake watched Gordon rise without saying a word. His face remained rigid, the anger draining into something harder to name. Not remorse, not quite fear. More like watching a part of himself slip out of his grasp without knowing how to pull it back. Gordon turned toward the door. He did not look at Jake. He did not look at the young soldiers. He did not look at anyone in the diner. He simply stepped forward, leaning on the cane in a steady rhythm. The sound of the cane striking the floor came evenly, slow, like the heartbeat of someone long accustomed to standing back up after sudden pain. A customer in the corner rose, about to help, but Gordon tilted his head slightly, signaling no. The man stopped, then slowly sat back down, a sense of displacement settling over him. As Gordon passed the counter, the owner clenched the dish towel in her hand, her face pale. She leaned forward and said in a choked voice, "Please, no more." It was unclear whether she was speaking to Gordon, to Jake, or to the reality that had just unfolded in her small diner. The words fell quietly. No one answered. Gordon continued toward the door. He pushed gently. The glass door opened, streetlight spilling a thin layer of brightness across his shoulders. Cold air rushed in, stirring his jacket. He stepped outside. The door closed behind him with a soft click, not loud, but final enough to extinguish any hope that things could return to where they were. Jake watched Gordon's silhouette through the glass. His vision wavered, not from tears, but from a mind compressed by cascading, tangled thoughts. The diner remained frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. Everyone stared either at the glass door or at the marks the cane had left on the tile floor. At the far end of the counter, the phone resting against the neatly folded cloth lit up briefly, then went dark. The screen sank into deep black, reflecting the diner like a distorted mirror. No one inside knew whose hands the video would end up in. No one knew whether it would stop here or travel far. No one knew how the futures of everyone in that room would change. Only one thing was certain: what had just happened no longer belonged to them. It had been recorded, and it was now waiting for another hand to decide the fate of all of them. What happened at the diner did not spread through shouting or rumors. It did not erupt across the base, did not send officers blowing whistles to assemble troops in the night. Everything sank beneath the surface, as a small stone dropped into a wide lake, and the ripples began to spread in the quietest way possible. No one in the unit spoke about that night out loud. They carried it instead in their eyes, in the way they stood and moved, in the unnatural pauses when they passed Jake. But that kind of silence never lasts long, because people rarely keep secrets when fear seeps into every breath. One young soldier from the group, the one standing behind Jake when everything slipped off the rails, sat in a base pickup truck the following evening. Yard lights shone through the windshield, carving tension into the lines of his face. His right hand rested on the steering wheel, trembling slightly. He knew exactly what made it shake, and it was not the cold. The image of Gordon falling to the diner floor replayed in his mind frame by frame, so vivid, it felt like a video he could not shut off. He had thought he could forget, but his body would not. All day, he avoided everyone's eyes, even his own in the bathroom mirror. When he did look at himself, he saw a feeling he had never named before. He saw wrong. He picked up his phone, his hand shaking so badly, he nearly dropped it. He dialed an internal number. One ring, then the other end answered. The duty officer's voice came through. "Steady. Support center. Your request." The soldier drew a long breath, his breathing uneven, then said, "I need to report something." His voice was hoarse, close to breaking, not because he was crying, because he had just broken his own oath of silence, and he knew he had no other choice. There were no follow-up questions on the other end, just a short reply. "Report to the auxiliary command room. 10 minutes. He ended the call, closed his eyes for a few seconds, then opened the truck door and stepped out. Each step made his chest feel heavier. He did not know what would happen after this moment, but he knew one thing clearly from here on. There was no way back. His report led to old files being pulled from storage, boxes layered with years of dust, folders clipped with blue ink marks from a time no one spoke about anymore. The base archive room, usually silent, suddenly became a bridge between past and present. A senior officer, one who had lived through 2 different generations of operations, opened a thick file, and stopped at a page bearing a familiar signature. He rested his hand on the cover and let out a quiet breath, as if touching something that had slept too long. He murmured, almost to himself, "Titan, no one's touched this in a long time." The word traveled through the briefing room like a note held too long, and released into an unfamiliar echo. Those present exchanged looks. No one asked what Titan was. They understood that if the file was opened, there was a reason strong enough to dig up a name that, for many years, no one wanted to mention. The video from the phone in the diner was placed on the table. The screen showed Gordon falling, Jake frozen in place, the cane rolling across the floor, white light spilling over the tile. No one spoke. As the video played, the expressions of those watching tightened frame by frame. A younger officer glanced toward the senior commander, at the head of the table. The commander said nothing, only pressed rewind to watch it again. Not fast, not slow. He watched every second as if reading a battlefield report rather than footage from an old diner. There was no argument, no defense. No one said Jake had been under pressure. No one tried to explain that Gordon provoked him. No one said Gordon had once been a soldier. None of that was needed. The truth was running on the screen before them, quieter than testimony, clearer than investigation. One officer wrote a few lines into the record. The commander nodded. "Proceed." His voice was not loud, but it was enough to end the meeting. Everyone understood the matter had passed beyond hesitation. Now the system would do its part. A name was struck from the operational roster at the end of the day. No lengthy note. No reason was written on the front page. Just a straight red line. Clean and final. That name had once appeared on small commendation lists, on special mission briefs, and had been spoken during performance evaluations. Now it was pulled from the line as a load-bearing pillar was removed from a structure no one believed could collapse. Jake did not know this right away. He spent the afternoon in the gym, lifting more weight than necessary, striking the heavy bag until the skin over his knuckles split. Teammates watched in silence. No one spoke. They knew what awaited him, even if they did not say it. They heard it through half-finished sentences in hallways, through the looks of security officers, through words no one read but everyone felt. As evening settled, the sky turned a dull metallic gray. Jake returned to his room, his hands still burning, his shoulders stiff with ache. He was about to sit down when there was a knock on the door. Slow, even, not the hurried knock of a roommate. The kind of knock made by someone carrying out a duty they did not want. Jake opened the door. A young officer stood there holding a brown envelope. He did not meet Jake's eyes. He offered the envelope with both hands. "Notification for you." Jake took it. His fingers brushed the edge of the paper, the stiffness of the envelope pricking his palm. He opened it, unfolded the sheet inside. The first line appeared like a cold period in his chest. Summons to a court-martial. He stood still. Air from the hallway drifted in, brushing past the open door. The officer inclined his head slightly and turned away, moving quickly. Unwilling to prolong the moment, Jake stared at the paper in his hand. No anger, no reaction, no words. His eyes rested only on the red stamp in the corner, small but heavy, carrying the weight of a night he thought he had left behind. The room was completely silent. Jake stood in the middle of it, still holding the paper, shoulders unmoving, not knowing what waited for him tomorrow. Knowing only this, what happened in the diner no longer belonged to him. It had entered the system, and the files and the video were placed on the briefing table, and now it had returned to him in a form he could not escape. In that moment, he understood that from here on, there would be no retreat. The military courtroom was small, low-ceilinged, with white lights shining down on faces carrying the same severity found on any base. Jake stood before the bench, both hands placed side by side, not clenched, not shaking, but inside him, it felt as if a hollow part of his body had been filled with stone. He had not spoken since the hearing began. Not a single justification, not an apology, not even an attempt at explanation. He did not know what there was left to explain when the diner video had been played at the start of the session, and everything he had done was visible. Every movement, every breath, every moment of Gordon falling. The military judge read the sentence in an even voice, without anger, without sympathy. It was simply the voice of someone doing their job. The words landed like hammer strikes against the walls of the room. Jake heard each one, but he did not lift his head. His eyes stayed lowered, fixed on his worn combat boots, on the scuffed toes from overtraining. He remained still as the sentence was completed. No reaction, no shift in posture. When the final line was spoken, the room paused for a beat. Then a security officer stepped forward and signaled for him to move. Jake left the courtroom to the sound of heavy footsteps, each step adding another mark to what he had driven himself into. His military life ended there. No speech, no comrades standing at attention. emotion, no hand on his shoulder after the hearing. Everything ended cleanly and briefly, like a command line deleted from a mission log. In the days that followed, Jake's unit was quietly reorganized. One soldier from the group, the one who had witnessed everything but could not speak that night, was reassigned to a secondary base. No one saw him off. No one asked questions. No one discussed it. They only watched him shoulder his bag, step off the truck, and walk away. The silence carried something like fear. The fear of standing too close to something that might change their lives. Another soldier stood on the training ground watching the vehicle pass through the gate, swallowed the weight in his throat, then returned to drills as if no one had disappeared. During all of this, Gordon knew nothing. He heard no news, saw no reports, and no one at the diner spoke to him about what had happened. No one wanted to worry him, and no one thought he needed to know more. To many people, Gordon was what remained of a time no one fully understood but everyone respected from a careful distance, and he lived the way those long returned from war live. If he woke up that day, then that day was one he still had to move through. One morning, before the sun had fully risen, Gordon gently pushed open the familiar diner door. It opened, the bell chiming softly, followed by a wave of cold air from the air conditioner hitting his face. The smell of grease, coffee, and spoons stirring cups blended as if nothing in the world had changed. The familiar server behind the counter saw him, her eyes lighting up for a moment, then asked in the same daily voice. The usual Gordon nodded, not smiling, but his look was enough for her to understand that he appreciated the familiarity. He moved slowly to the same table by the window, one hand on the cane, the other trembling slightly as he pulled out the chair. When he sat down, the cane was placed beside the chair with the same care a soldier uses when setting down a rifle after a mission. He adjusted the coffee cup when it was brought out, turning it lightly as if checking the warmth of something he had held for many years. Outside, the television mounted on the wall was not loud, but loud enough for words to drift into the morning air. The host spoke about post-war responsibility from decades past, about files being reviewed again, about who needed to atone and who needed compensation. Words like duty, memory, trauma, and reintegration fell in steady blocks. Gordon listened without really listening. He had passed through those debates with his own body, and he understood that most of those words never touched the reality of those who survived. Some losses did not need to be named and could not be repaid. He sat there for a long time. No one disturbed him. A few customers came and went, the sound of the door opening and closing blending with the breathing of a place too familiar to notice. Gordon took a sip of coffee, the bitterness spreading across his tongue, recalling the habit that had brought him back here through so many sleepless nights. His hand rested on the cane handle, not gripping tightly, but enough to let the cold metal seep into his palm. He looked out the window. Outside, cars passed, the sky a pale gray, light wind pushing flyers flat against the road. Some people hurried by, some smoked slowly, some stood waiting for rides. Life continued in its own way, regardless of what had happened in the diner days before, or what had unfolded on the base not far away. Gordon watched it like someone observing water flowing from an old stream. No need to step in, no demand for more. He was not cleared in any meeting. No medal was given to him. No one called him in to testify or to thank him. What happened beyond that diner had no place for him. He did not know, and he did not need to. He kept living, carrying the portion of life belonging to those who did not return, as he always had. A quiet clung to every step he took, every breath he held. Every night he leaned on his cane to come here so he would not be swallowed by the silence of an empty apartment. And then, as the light slanted down onto the road, Gordon looked out the window again. Everything outside was still moving. People walked, cars passed, someone laughed. Smoke from the neighboring diner drifted across in thin streaks. The young soldier lost his career. Others scattered. The machine kept running the way it always did. There was no apology addressed to anyone. No report spoke of Gordon's name with warmth. No hearing summoned him to witness justice. Yet he still sat here, in the small diner, under white lights, among sleepless nights, among memories no one shared. Gordon looked out the window. Life went on. The darkness stayed. The story between Gordon and Jake shows that some wounds do not exist in the body, but in the memories people carry for a lifetime. The old man stays silent because he has endured enough, and the young man explodes in anger because he fears being looked down on. When these two kinds of misunderstanding collide, tragedy becomes the most likely outcome. From a small incident in a diner, we can see a larger lesson. Do not rush to judge anyone based on a few moments. Some people are silent because they have lost too much. Some people raise their voices because they are hiding their own fear, and sometimes, just 1 second of lost control is enough to change the direction of an entire life. The story reminds us that understanding is stronger than violence, and that restraint is sometimes the only way to avoid pushing someone into darkness one more time. If this story made you reflect, please share it so more people can learn from it. Thank you for following along. I will continue to bring truly meaningful and emotionally rich content. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel to see more meaningful stories.